This is how the American empire falls on its people. Not from the outside. Not from an invasion. Not from a single catastrophic event that everyone can point to and say that is when it happened. It falls on you the way rust eats iron. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once when the structure finally gives way under weight, it was no longer strong enough to hold. 1/3 of the American middle class cannot afford basic necessities in 2026. Nearly 3/4 of American workers cannot afford anything beyond basic living expenses. The gap between what American workers produce and what they are paid represents one of the largest wealth transfers in modern economic history. And the national debt just crossed $36 trillion, which is larger than the entire GDP of the country, while interest payments alone exceeded $1 trillion for the first time ever, which is more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, and roughly equal to everything the government spends on everything that is not Social Security, defense, or interest. This is how the American empire falls on its people. Not with a bang, with a bill. Fortune magazine just described what it feels like to be inside a declining empire, and most Americans recognize themselves. In April 2026, Fortune magazine published an article that captured something no economic data set has ever been able to quantify. They described a peculiar kind of vertigo that comes with being an affluent American in 2026. You have made it. By nearly every historical metric, you are living in spectacular abundance. You have a six-figure income, a retirement account, a car, and yet something feels wrong. Crowded, competitive, precarious, the airport lounge is too full, the housing market makes no sense. The life you thought you had paid for keeps getting more expensive. That description is not about the poor, it is about the upper middle class. It is about people who by every traditional standard have succeeded and who still feel the ground shifting beneath them. Fortune cited a sweeping report from the American Enterprise Institute showing that the U.S. is so broadly wealthy that its poorest members are wealthier than the average world citizen. But the report also identified the mechanism that makes that wealth feel meaningless in practice. Healthcare, education, housing, and construction have not seen the productivity breakthroughs that technology, finance, and professional services have. The result is wage compression at the bottom, explosive wealth creation at the top, and the upper middle class caught in between, statistically thriving but existentially anxious. And that anxiety is not irrational. It is the lived experience of what happens when an empire generates enormous aggregate wealth while simultaneously making the cost of participating in that empire unaffordable for the people who generate the wealth. The economy is producing more output than ever. The people inside the economy are keeping less of it than at any point in the past 50 years. That is not a recession. It is not a depression. It is something that economics does not have a clean word for because it has never happened at this scale in a nation this wealthy. It is the feeling of abundance that you cannot access. It is watching the empire's GDP climb while your grocery bill climbs faster. It is reading that unemployment is low while your neighbor works 2 jobs and still cannot afford his insulin. It is the dissonance between the numbers on the screen and the numbers on the receipt. And that dissonance is the first thing ordinary citizens feel when an empire begins to fall on them. And let me tell you what the dissonance looks like in practice, because the numbers do not capture it. It looks like a 55-year-old registered nurse who has worked in the same hospital for 22 years, who earns $82,000, who has health insurance through her employer, who has a 401k with $180,000 in it, and who cannot afford to retire, cannot afford to move to a better school district for her grandchildren, cannot afford the dental work she has been postponing for 3 years, and cannot afford the out-of-pocket cost of the medication. Her insurance technically covers because the deductible is $3,500. And she has not hit it. She is not poor by any historical standard. She is not poor by any global standard. She is a healthcare professional, earning above the national median in the richest country in the history of the world. And she is rationing her own healthcare because the system she works inside every day charges prices that her position inside that system cannot afford. That is what the empire falling on its people looks like up close. It looks like a 62-year-old electrician in Ohio who owns his home, drives a truck that is paid off, has no credit card debt, did everything that every financial advisor told him to do, and who discovered in January that his homeowner's insurance premium increased 38% in 1 year because of weather-related losses in states he does not live in. His property taxes were reassessed upward by $1,400 because home values climbed even though he has no intention of selling, and his Medicare Part B premium consumed 1/3 of his Social Security COLA before he spent $1 on food or gas. He is not irresponsible. He is not living beyond his means. He planned for a country that no longer exists. The country he planned for had stable insurance costs, predictable property taxes, and a social security adjustment that actually adjusted for the cost of living. That country is gone, and the country that replaced it punishes him for having been responsible, because the responsible decisions he made were based on assumptions about costs and stability that the empire's own policies have destroyed. And the data behind the dissonance is more damning than the individual stories. New Trader U documented in January 2026 that 1/3 of the American middle class cannot afford basic necessities. In every single one of 160 metropolitan areas studied, at least 20% of middle-class earners cannot afford to live in their own communities. Middle-income wage growth has dropped to 1.5%, the lowest in over a year. Nearly 3/4 of American workers cannot afford anything beyond basic living expenses. 9% of working families with children under 6 are pushed out of the middle class entirely by childcare costs alone. Full-time care for 2 children exceeds $20,000 per year, more than many families spend on housing. And 446,000 middle-class families are pushed into a lower income bracket every single year, solely by childcare expenses. The GovFacts Shrinking Middle Class report published this month documented that this represents a 5-decade trend of systematic economic squeeze driven by 4 forces operating simultaneously. Globalization displaced middle-skill manufacturing jobs. Technology automated routine cognitive work. Financialization redirected capital from productive investment to speculative activity, and policy choices in taxation, regulation, and public investment systematically favored asset owners over wage earners. The report warns that when large segments of the population feel their hard work is no longer rewarded, faith in core institutions erodes, and societies become vulnerable to political extremism, social unrest, and authoritarian movements. That is not a prediction about the future. That is a description of the present. The middle class is not shrinking because people are making bad decisions. It is shrinking because the cost of middle-class life has outpaced the income that middle-class work provides. A teacher, a firefighter, a nurse, an electrician in 1985 could afford a home, healthcare, and a family vacation on a single income. The same jobs in 2026 cannot fund that lifestyle on 2 incomes in most metropolitan areas. The jobs did not change. The empire changed around them. Productivity doubled, and wages went nowhere, and the difference was the largest wealth transfer in modern history. Between 1979 and 2024, American worker productivity increased by approximately 65%. Over the same period, hourly compensation for the median worker increased by approximately 15% after adjusting for inflation. The gap between those two numbers, productivity up 65, compensation up 15, represents the wealth that was produced by American workers and captured by someone else. The Economic Policy Institute has documented this divergence extensively and describes it as the most significant structural change in the American economy since the Great Depression. Before 1979, productivity and compensation moved together. When workers produced more, they earned more. The connection was not perfect, but it was directional. After 1979, the connection broke. Workers continued producing more. Their compensation flatlined, and the surplus, the difference between what was produced and what was paid, flowed upward into corporate profits, into executive compensation, into shareholder returns, into the financial sector, into the asset values of the people who owned the means of production rather than operated them. The result is visible in every wealth distribution chart published in the last 20 years. The top 1% of American households now own more wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. The top 10% own approximately 89% of all stocks. The bottom 50% own approximately 1%. And the mechanism by which this concentration occurred was not theft, it was structural. Tax policy favored capital income over labor income. Trade policy allowed manufacturing to move to lower-wage countries. Technology automated the middle-skill jobs that had provided the majority of middle-class incomes. Immigration policy expanded the labor supply in specific sectors, suppressing wage growth. And monetary policy, through near-zero interest rates for over a decade, inflated the value of financial assets that the wealthy own while doing nothing for the wages that workers earn. Each of these policies had a rational justification in isolation. Together, they constituted a wealth pump that transferred approximately $50 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1% over 4 decades, according to a Rand Corporation study. $50 trillion. That is not a metaphor. That is a peer-reviewed estimate of the income that the bottom 90% of American workers would have received if the pre-1979 productivity to compensation relationship had continued. It did not continue. and the $50 trillion went somewhere else. And the people who lost it are the people who are now skipping meals, financing their groceries on installment plans, delaying medical care, and telling pollsters that raising a child in America is unaffordable. They are not failing. The system that was supposed to convert their productivity into prosperity redirected it, and the redirection has a date of origin that most Americans have never been taught. In 1971, President Richard Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. Before that decision, the dollar was backed by physical gold at a fixed ratio, which constrained the government's ability to print money and limited the financial system's ability to create credit. After that decision, the dollar was backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is a polite way of saying the dollar was backed by the government's ability to tax and its willingness to maintain fiscal discipline. And the government's fiscal discipline lasted approximately 4 years. By 1975, the federal deficit was climbing. By the 1980s, the national debt had begun its exponential ascent, and the financial sector, freed from the discipline that the gold standard imposed, began the process of financialization that has since turned every human necessity into a leverageable asset. Housing became a speculative instrument. Healthcare became a profit center. Education became a debt product. Retirement became a market bet. And the labor of ordinary Americans became the raw material that powered a financial system designed to extract value at every point of contact. The gold standard was not perfect. No monetary system is, but its removal eliminated the last structural constraint on the government's ability to debase the currency and the financial sector's ability to leverage the population's productivity for its own enrichment. And the $50 trillion in redirected wealth that the Rand Corporation documented is the cumulative result of 55 years of operation without that constraint. The wealth pump did not turn on by accident. It was unshackled by a policy decision. And the people who made that decision, and every subsequent decision that deepened the financialization of American life, were never the people who paid the price. Basic human needs have been turned into profit machines, and that is the economic signature of a falling empire. Healthcare costs in the United States have increased approximately 300% faster than wages over the past 4 decades. Not because medical science has become 300% more complex, because a web of insurance companies, pharmaceutical corporations, hospital systems, and administrative middlemen have turned illness into a profit opportunity. Americans spend more per capita on healthcare than any other country on Earth, and have worse outcomes on nearly every major health metric than comparable developed nations. Life expectancy in the United States is lower than in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, Australia, and dozens of other countries that spend less. Infant mortality is higher. Chronic disease rates are higher. Medical bankruptcy, a concept that does not exist in most developed countries because healthcare costs are managed or capped, is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in America. And the Affordable Care Act subsidies that made marketplace insurance affordable for 22 million Americans expired on January 1, 2026. KFF analysis shows premiums for qualifying households more than doubled, from $888 to $1,904 per month. The Commonwealth Fund estimates 5 million Americans will lose coverage entirely. Housing follows the same pattern. Home sale prices have increased 81% since 2017, according to the Urban Institute. Rents have increased 54% over the same period. In each of 160 U.S. metro areas studied, at least 20% of middle-class earners cannot afford to live in their own communities after adjusting for local income and price variations. In Arlington, Virginia, the upper threshold of middle-class income now exceeds $280,000. In the same metropolitan region where the government that is supposed to regulate the economy operates, a household earning $200,000 is no longer considered upper middle class. It is middle class. And middle class in Arlington means you can barely afford a house. Childcare costs more than college tuition in 38 states, according to the Economic Policy Institute. Approximately 446,000 middle-class families are pushed into a lower income bracket every year solely by childcare expenses, not by job loss. Not by poor decisions, by the cost of keeping their children supervised while they work at the jobs that do not pay them enough to afford the childcare. Education has followed the same trajectory. The cost of a 4-year degree at a public university has increased approximately 200% since 2000 in inflation-adjusted dollars. Total student loan debt exceeds $1.77 trillion. And the jobs that the degrees were supposed to secure increasingly do not pay enough to service the debt that funded them. When shelter, healthcare, education, and childcare, the 4 pillars of a functional middle-class life, are all simultaneously unaffordable for the people who work full-time, the economy has not failed accidentally. It has been restructured deliberately to extract maximum value from the population at every stage of their lives. Birth costs money, childcare costs money, education costs money, healthcare costs money, housing costs money, retirement costs money, death costs money. And at every stage, the institutions that control access to these necessities have been optimized for profit extraction rather than service delivery. That is not capitalism functioning as designed. That is an empire's infrastructure consuming its own population. And the mechanism of consumption has a name that most Americans have never heard. Economists call it cost disease. It was first described by William Baumol in the 1960s, and it explains why the industries that serve the most fundamental human needs, healthcare, education, housing, caregiving, consistently see costs rise faster than wages and faster than inflation. In sectors like technology and manufacturing, productivity gains allow companies to produce more with fewer workers, which drives costs down. In sectors like healthcare and education, the work is inherently labor-intensive and resists automation. You cannot automate a surgery. You cannot automate the relationship between a teacher and a child. You cannot automate the presence of a caregiver. But the workers in these sectors expect wages comparable to what workers in high-productivity sectors earn, because they live in the same economy and face the same cost of living. So, healthcare wages rise. Education wages rise. But the productivity of those sectors does not rise at the same rate, which means the cost of healthcare and education rises faster than wages in the broader economy. And the cost disease has been compounding for 60 years. Healthcare spending as a share of GDP has risen from approximately 5% in 1960 to approximately 17.3% in 2023. The United States spends nearly twice as much per capita on healthcare as the average OECD country. College tuition has outpaced inflation by a factor of approximately 4 over the past 40 years. And the cost disease is not solvable by market competition, because the sectors it affects are either natural monopolies, like regional hospital systems, or heavily regulated markets where price signals are distorted by insurance, government subsidies, and information asymmetry. The patient cannot comparison shop for an ambulance ride during a heart attack. The student cannot negotiate tuition with a college that holds accreditation monopoly in their region. The parent cannot decline childcare when their job requires them to be present 40 hours a week. The demand is inelastic. The supply is constrained, and the prices climb without limit because the alternative to paying is not finding a better deal. The alternative is going without healthcare, without education, without childcare, without housing. And going without any of those things produces consequences that are more expensive than paying the inflated price. So the population pays and pays and pays until the paying itself becomes the primary activity of their economic life, and nothing is left for savings, for investment, for entrepreneurship, for family formation, or for any of the activities that sustain a civilization across generations. $925 billion for the military and crumbling bridges at home is not strength, it is the sound of an empire eating itself. The Department of Defense budget request for fiscal year 2026 is $892.6 billion. The House Armed Services Committee pushed that number to $925 billion. The United States maintains approximately 750 to 800 military bases in roughly 80 countries across every inhabited continent. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, and the American Society of Civil Engineers gives the nation's infrastructure a cumulative grade of C-. The estimated investment needed to bring roads, bridges, water systems, electrical grids, airports, public transit, and dams to a state of good repair is $4.6 trillion. That gap between what is spent on projecting power abroad and what is invested in maintaining the foundation at home is not a budget debate, it is a civilizational choice. And it is the same choice that Spain, Britain, and Rome made before they fell. Every one of them prioritized military spending over domestic infrastructure during their late stages. Every one of them maintained the symbols of imperial strength, while the physical and social foundations beneath those symbols deteriorated. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars cost over $8 trillion according to Brown University's Costs of War project. Those wars lasted 2 decades, produced no lasting strategic gain, and consumed resources that could have funded the complete rebuilding of American infrastructure twice over. And now the Iran war, launched in February 2026 without congressional authorization, has closed the Strait of Hormuz, pushed oil above $100 per barrel, drained the strategic petroleum reserve to its lowest level since the 1980s, and triggered the worst inflation spike in 4 years. The oil industry is warning the White House that inventories are at tank bottom and that a price spike is coming in weeks. Gas is $4.26 a gallon. The IEA called the situation the greatest energy security challenge in history. And the $925 billion defense budget continues to climb while 771,000 Americans are homeless, the highest number ever recorded. While 40 million Americans depend on SNAP for food. While 90 million depend on Medicaid for healthcare. While the electrical grid receives a grade of C- and an estimated $208 billion is needed to bring it to acceptable condition. While 43% of public roads are in poor or mediocre condition. While 7.5% of the nation's bridges are structurally deficient, the empire projects strength outward, while the population experiences decay inward. And the population increasingly understands the trade-off. They see the aircraft carriers, they also see the potholes. They see the military bases in 80 countries. They also see the bridge that was flagged as structurally deficient 5 years ago and has not been repaired. They see the $925 billion defense line item. They also see the $1,904 health insurance premium that they cannot afford. And the gap between what the empire spends on maintaining its status and what it spends on maintaining its people is the measurement of how far the fall has progressed. And here is a number that will make you physically angry if you understand what it means. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, interest payments on the national debt alone will exceed $1.7 trillion per year. That is more than the current defense budget and current Medicare spending combined. By 2034, the single largest line item in the federal budget will not be defense. It will not be Social Security. It will not be health care. It will be interest on money the government already borrowed. You are not paying interest on investments in your future. You are paying interest on expenditures that already happened. Wars already fought. Tax cuts already granted. Stimulus already distributed. Contracts already awarded. The money is gone. The debt remains. And the interest on the debt is consuming the revenue that could fund the infrastructure, the education, the healthcare, the housing, and the social programs that the population actually needs. Every year that interest payments climb, the discretionary budget shrinks. And the discretionary budget is where infrastructure spending lives, where scientific research lives, where education funding lives, where environmental protection lives, where all of the investments that build a civilization's future capacity live. The mandatory budget, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest is on autopilot. It grows regardless of what Congress does. The discretionary budget is where choices are made. And the choices are getting smaller every year because the mandatory spending and the interest are consuming everything. By the time today's 30-year-olds reach retirement age, the federal government's ability to fund anything beyond Social Security, Medicare, defense, and interest payments will be essentially zero unless taxes are raised dramatically or the programs are restructured. Neither is politically feasible, so the empire continues borrowing, the interest continues climbing, the discretionary space continues shrinking, and the population continues experiencing the consequences of an empire that is eating its own capacity to function. The water main breaks because the water infrastructure budget was cut. The bridge collapses because the transportation budget was diverted. The school fails because the education budget was frozen. The veteran cannot get care because the VA is overwhelmed and underfunded. Each of these failures is individually tragic. Collectively, they are the signature of an empire that has consumed its own foundation to fund its own overhead. And the overhead, the interest on the debt, is the one expense that cannot be cut, cannot be negotiated, and cannot be defaulted on without triggering the collapse of the global financial system that the empire built. Your currency is being debased in real time, and the mechanism is designed to be invisible to you. The M2 money supply in the United States increased from approximately $15.4 trillion in January 2020 to approximately $21.5 trillion by early 2022, a 40% increase in 2 years. The Federal Reserve created approximately $6 trillion in new dollars and pumped them into the financial system through quantitative easing, emergency lending facilities, and asset purchases. And the effect of that creation was a 26% increase in consumer prices between 2019 and 2026, which means that every dollar you saved before 2020 now buys approximately 74 cents worth of goods. You are not taxed. You are not robbed in any legally recognizable way. Your bank account shows the same number it showed before, but the purchasing power of that number has been reduced by a quarter. That is currency debasement. It is functionally identical to what Rome did when it reduced the silver content of the denarius, what Spain did when it debased its coins, and what Britain did when it printed pounds to fund its wars. The mechanism is different. The outcome is the same. Your savings buy less, your income covers less, Your retirement target, which you calculated based on pre-debasement prices, is now approximately 26% further away than you thought it was, and the people who benefited from the $6 trillion in new money were not the people who save in dollars. They were the people who own assets priced in dollars. When the Fed flooded the system with $6 trillion, stock prices rose, real estate prices rose, bond prices rose. The value of every financial asset increased because there were more dollars chasing the same assets. The top 10%, who own 89% of stocks, captured nearly all of the asset appreciation. The bottom 90%, who hold their wealth primarily in cash savings, home equity, and wages, captured almost none. And then the inflation that the money printing created eroded the purchasing power of the cash savings and wages that the bottom 90% depend on. The wealth pump operated through the Federal Reserve itself. New money was created. It flowed to asset owners. Asset prices rose. Then the inflation caused by the new money eroded the savings of non-asset owners. The rich got richer from the assets. The non-rich got poorer from the inflation. And the Fed described the entire process as supporting the economy. It supported the economy the way a tourniquet supports a limb, by cutting off circulation to the parts that were supposed to benefit. And the Fed itself has been operating at a loss for more than 2 years, accumulating over $200 billion in deferred losses on its balance sheet. In 2021, the Fed remitted $107 billion to the Treasury. In 2023, 2024, and 2025, it sent zero. The institution that printed the money that caused the inflation that eroded your savings is now itself insolvent, and the revenue it used to send to the Treasury that used to reduce your tax burden has disappeared. The consequences of the debasement are being paid at every level of the system. By the consumer, through higher prices. By the saver, through lost purchasing power. By the Treasury, through lost Fed remittances. By the taxpayer, through higher deficits that the lost remittances generate. And by future generations, through the $36 trillion in debt that the debasement was designed to make serviceable, but instead made larger. And the cruelest dimension of currency debasement is that it functions as a regressive tax that nobody voted for. When prices rise 26%, a family earning $50,000 that spends 85% of its income on necessities experiences the full force of that increase on nearly every dollar they earn. A family earning $500,000 that spends 35% of its income on necessities experiences the increase on a much smaller share of their total income, and the remaining income can be invested in assets that appreciate during inflationary periods. The poor pay more, the rich profit, and nobody legislated it, nobody debated it, nobody voted on it. The Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee, 12 people, 7 appointed by the president and 5 rotating among regional Fed bank presidents, made the decision to create $6 trillion in new money. That decision was not subject to a congressional vote. It was not subject to public comment. It was made in a closed meeting and announced afterward. And the distributional consequences of that decision were more significant than any tax bill Congress has passed in the last 20 years. If every American understood that inflation is a policy choice, not a natural phenomenon, and that the policy disproportionately benefits asset owners at the expense of wage earners, the political pressure to reform the Federal Reserve would be overwhelming. The pressure does not exist because the understanding does not exist, and the understanding does not exist because the system was designed by people who benefit from its opacity. Institutional trust has collapsed to levels that historians associate with pre-revolutionary conditions. Gallup's annual Institutional Confidence Survey reads like the vital signs of a patient in critical condition. Trust in Congress stands at 8%. Trust in the presidency has fallen below 30%. Trust in the Supreme Court has dropped to 25%. Trust in television news is at 11%. Trust in newspapers has fallen to 18%. Trust in big business sits at 14%. Trust in the medical system has fallen from 80% in 1975 to 34%. Trust in public schools has dropped from 62% to 26%. Every major American institution has lost majority public confidence over the past 5 decades. Every single one. And the erosion is not partisan. It crosses party lines, income levels, age groups, and geographic regions. Americans do not disagree about whether institutions are failing. They agree on that. They disagree about who is to blame and what should replace them. Historian Peter Turchin identified institutional distrust as one of the 3 key drivers of civilizational instability, alongside elite overproduction and popular immiseration, and his model, which predicted in 2010 that the 2020s would be the most politically unstable decade in the United States since the Civil War era, has been confirmed by every data point since the January 6th Capitol breach. the 2 impeachments, the 3 credit rating downgrades, the government shutdowns that disrupted SNAP benefits in 25 states, the war launched without congressional authorization, the consumer sentiment reading of 47.6, the lowest in 75 years of survey data, the record homelessness, the record household debt, the record auto repossessions since 2008, the record credit card delinquencies in a decade. Every one of these data points is a symptom of the same underlying condition. The institutions that were designed to regulate, protect, and serve the population have been captured by the interests they were supposed to regulate, defunded by the political dynamics they were supposed to transcend, and hollowed out by the same wealth concentration that has hollowed out the middle class. The SEC is funded at a level that allows it to prosecute a fraction of the financial fraud it identifies. The IRS has been systematically defunded over decades, reducing its ability to audit wealthy taxpayers who use complex structures to minimize their tax burden, which shifts the enforcement burden downward onto middle-class and working-class taxpayers who cannot afford accountants. The FTC lacks the resources to challenge anti-competitive mergers that reduce consumer choice and increase prices. The EPA lacks the resources to enforce environmental regulations that protect public health. The institutions exist. They have offices and employees and letterhead, but they do not have the capacity to perform the functions they were created to perform, and the population knows it. The 8% confidence in Congress is not cynicism. It is an accurate assessment of a legislative body that has not passed meaningful reform on any structural issue facing the country. Not the debt, not Social Security, not healthcare costs, not housing, not immigration, not the tax code, not campaign finance, in over a decade. The paralysis is not temporary. It is a feature of a political system in which the cost of winning an election has become so high that every elected official is permanently indebted to the donors who funded their campaign. And those donors are disproportionately the same corporations and individuals who benefit from the structural status quo that reform would disrupt. Empires do not fall on their elites, and that is the part of this story nobody wants to say out loud. When Rome fell, the senators kept their estates. When Spain defaulted, the grandaudis kept their gold. When Britain lost its empire, the aristocracy kept their land. Empires do not fall on the people who ran them. They fall on the people who lived inside them. The people who worked the fields, who manned the legions, who operated the looms, who built the roads. The people who were told that the empire's success was their success and the empire's costs would be shared equally. They were not shared equally. They were never shared equally. And the people who paid the most for the empire, in labor, in taxes, in military service, in reduced opportunity, in shortened lifespans, were always the people who benefited the least from it. The Roman senator who lived on a 1,000-acre estate with slave labor and a private aqueduct did not experience the fall of Rome the same way the farmer in Gaul experienced it. The British aristocrat who owned coal mines and textile mills did not experience the end of the British Empire the same way the factory worker in Manchester experienced it. And the American billionaire who holds his wealth in diversified global assets, who owns property in multiple countries, who has access to private healthcare and private security and private education and private transportation, will not experience the decline of the American empire the same way you will experience it. Because the mechanisms of imperial decline, currency debasement, inflation, institutional decay, infrastructure deterioration, rising costs of basic necessities, and the redirection of public resources toward military projection and debt service, all of these mechanisms disproportionately affect the people who depend on the institutions that are decaying, who save in the currency that is being debased, who drive on the roads that are not being repaired, who depend on the safety net that is being cut, and who cannot relocate to a jurisdiction with lower costs because their entire life, their family, their community, their job, their home is embedded in the empire that is falling on them. The billionaire can move. You cannot. The billionaire can hedge. You cannot. The billionaire has access to information, to financial instruments, to legal structures, to political influence that insulate him from the consequences of the policies he helped create. You do not. And that asymmetry, the fact that the people who designed the system that is failing are also the people who are most insulated from its failure, is not a coincidence. It is the structural feature that ensures the system will continue failing until it cannot function at all, because the people with the power to fix it have no incentive to fix it. They are not experiencing the problem, and the people who are experiencing the problem have no power to fix it. They are too busy surviving the consequences of the system to reform the system that created the consequences. That feedback loop, where the people with power have no pain and the people with pain have no power, is the central dynamic of every imperial decline in recorded history. It is the mechanism by which empires fall on their people. And it is operating in the United States right now in June of 2026 at a speed and a scale that the historical record says accelerates from this point forward. And the acceleration has a specific cause that most commentators avoid naming because naming it implicates the entire political class. The cost of winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 2024 exceeded $2.5 million on average. The cost of winning a Senate seat exceeded $15 million. The cost of winning the presidency exceeded $1 billion. That money comes overwhelmingly from corporations, industry PACs, and wealthy individuals who do not donate out of civic duty. They donate to secure access, influence, and favorable policy outcomes. The pharmaceutical industry spends more on lobbying than any other industry in the United States, approximately $370 million per year. And the United States is the only developed country where prescription drug prices are not regulated by the government. The real estate industry and the financial sector are among the largest campaign contributors. And the United States has the most expensive housing market relative to median incomes and the most lightly regulated financial sector among developed nations. The energy industry contributes hundreds of millions to campaigns, and the United States has the weakest climate and energy regulations of any G7 nation. The pattern is not subtle. The industries that contribute the most to campaigns get the most favorable regulatory treatment, and the most favorable regulatory treatment produces the highest costs for consumers. And the highest costs for consumers are the mechanism by which the empire falls on its people. The campaign finance system is the transmission belt that converts corporate wealth into regulatory capture into higher consumer costs into household financial stress into depleted savings, and rising debt and depleted savings and rising debt into the behavioral retreat from the future that the survey data is now documenting in real time. Remove the transmission belt and the machine stops. But the transmission belt is protected by the same political class that it empowers, which means removing it requires the cooperation of the people who benefit from keeping it in place, and the global contrast makes the domestic failure even more visible. While the American empire consumes its own population, its primary competitor is investing in theirs. China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty over 4 decades. It now produces a third of global industrial output. In purchasing power parity terms, China's GDP exceeds America's. China leads in renewable energy deployment, electric vehicle production, 5G infrastructure, and high-speed rail. It has built more than 27,000 miles of high-speed rail in 15 years. The United States has built Zero, California's high-speed rail project, announced in 2008 with a projected cost of $33 billion, has been under construction for 18 years, has not completed a single mile of operational track, and the estimated cost has risen above $100 billion. That single comparison tells the story of 2 civilizations moving in opposite directions. One is investing in productive capacity, the other is consuming its productive capacity to fund military projection, debt service, and corporate profit extraction. China's infrastructure investment as a percentage of GDP consistently exceeds 40%. America's is approximately 3%. China's public education system, while imperfect, has improved test scores across every international benchmark over the past 2 decades. American test scores have declined, with math and reading proficiency falling to the lowest levels in decades according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. China's life expectancy has surpassed America's for the first time in recorded history. A Chinese citizen born today is statistically expected to live longer than an American citizen born today. That fact by itself is the most damning indictment of the American empire's relationship with its own people that any data set can produce. The richest country in the history of the world, spending more on healthcare than any nation on Earth, producing worse health outcomes than a country that was classified as developing within living memory. The empire is not falling because it lacks resources. It is falling because the resources are being directed toward maintaining the empire's status rather than maintaining the empire's people. And when the people can no longer sustain the weight of the empire above them, the structure collapses inward, not outward, inward, onto the people who held it up. And the evidence that the feedback loop is accelerating is visible in the behavioral data that McKinsey, Brookings, the Century Foundation, and every major consumer research firm is publishing. 29% of American adults dipped into their savings in the last quarter. Another 29% reduced their savings rate, 28% are using credit cards more. Buy now, pay later. Usage is climbing, and a growing number of Americans are using installment plans to pay for groceries. 34% of Americans skipped a meal in the past year. 29% delayed or skipped medical care due to cost. Among adults aged 18 to 29, nearly half delayed care. 1 in 4 delayed buying prescribed medication. Credit card delinquency rates are at the highest level in almost a decade. Auto repossessions are at the highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Student loan delinquencies are rising at record pace. The fertility rate has dropped to 1.62 births per woman, the lowest in American history. Bloomberg reported the United States may see its first population decline in 2026. 7 in 10 Americans say raising a child is unaffordable. These are not statistics about a temporary economic downturn. These are the behavioral signatures of a population that is retreating from the future. People who skip meals are not investing in their health. People who skip medication are not managing their chronic conditions. People who stop having children are not building the next generation's tax base, labor force, or consumer market. People who drain their savings are not funding their retirements. Every one of these behaviors represents a withdrawal from the long-term systems that sustain a civilization. And when enough people withdraw simultaneously, the systems themselves begin to fail, which generates more withdrawal, which generates more failure. That is the spiral. That is how the empire falls on its people. Not through a single dramatic event, but through millions of individual decisions, each one rational in isolation, each one a retreat from a future that the empire's own policies have made unaffordable, inaccessible, or unbelievable. Share this video with every American you know, because the empire does not announce when it begins to fall. It does not send a letter. It does not hold a press conference. It falls in the gap between the grocery receipt and the paycheck. It falls in the insurance premium that doubled. It falls in the rent increase that consumed the raise. It falls in the retirement that was pushed back another 5 years. It falls in the child that was not born because the parents could not afford a child in the richest country in the history of the world. That is how the empire falls on its people, one household at a time, one bill at a time, one decision at a time, until the decisions accumulate into a trajectory that no policy, no election, and no speech can reverse.